Since 1946, every new nation of Southeast Asia has annually celebrated its Day of Independence. Our struggle for independence is of the past, taken for granted. Theirs a most recent achievement and fiercely defended. The Philippines gained independence in 1946. India and Pakistan in 1947. Burma in 1948, Ceylon 1948. Indonesia in 1949. Vietnam in 1954. And Malaya in 1957. The story behind Southeast Asian independence is the story of nationalism. What exactly is nationalism? It's the feeling and belief by a people living within a certain territory that they ought to be unified into an independent homeland. It is the sense of belonging together, of sharing enough things in common, things like tradition, festivals, language, and in some cases religion. There is room for regional differences. The Indonesians, for example, speak 40 different dialects. The psychological need to belong to an independent nation has been a deep and powerful force in human affairs. During the last 4 centuries, the riches of Southeast Asia attracted the Europeans. They came to trade. They stayed to conquer. Backed by Europe's military might and industrial supremacy, they divided the area into colonies and exploited its resources. In the 19th century, the peoples of these Southeast Asian colonies had become second-class citizens of large empires. As one of the great storehouses of natural resources, Southeast Asia was a prize worth having. The colonizing countries were astute, for Southeast Asia proved within 100 years to be the producer of 5/6 of the world's natural rubber. More than half the world's supply of tin is produced here, and a considerable amount of other ores. The region is also the main supplier of kapok, used in pillows and life preservers. But most important, it produces rice in abundance, the vital staple food of Asian life. At present, the region supplies fully 60% of all the rice production in the world. Nearly as important as its natural wealth is Southeast Asia's key strategic position astride the main lines of communication between Europe and the Far East. These were tempting economic and military rewards which led the colonial powers to seek firm control over these countries. In Burma, for example, Britain appointed an English viceroy to replace the Burmese king, who had been head of the country's Buddhist religion as well as the head of the government. British traditions were introduced and drastic social changes followed. For example, the British imported their own legal system, but the British laws were understood by the Burmese and had disastrous consequences. Under the old laws, the peasants could never have their land taken from them. Now, if they didn't repay a loan, they could lose their farms. The colonial administration restricted native rights, ran the affairs of the colony to the advantage of the foreign elite, and left most of the natives at a low economic level. The colonizers defended their actions by pointing to the development of natural resources and transportation, improvements in communication, advances in health and sanitation, jobs in new businesses and industries, and the building of modern cities. The colonial powers brought their cars, their goods, and their money. They also brought better education and more democratic ideas. Some Asian people were inspired by the democratic ideas of Jefferson and Lincoln, and they began to publish their own ideas, to demand self-government for their own countries. During World War II, the Southeast Asians learned to become soldiers to fight the invading Japanese. By 1945, when Japan was defeated, the natives, now armed with weapons and democratic ideas, were determined to resist the imposition of any outside control by force. Demonstrations for independence had popular support. In Burma, the British Army returned, but was kept under constant alert by the attacks of the Burmese nationalists. After 2 years of struggle, the British finally granted Burma independence. In Indonesia, after World War II, the Dutch also tried to regain their control. Rioting broke out across the country when the resistance of 80 million Indonesians was united by the native army. The Dutch were finally forced to concede Indonesia its independence. But to keep popular support, Indonesia's leaders will have to increase food production, train workers in new skills, and improve the living condition for its people. In French Indo-China during World War II, communist guerrilla fighters took the lead in the national resistance to the Japanese invaders and so gained the confidence of the people. The communist publications presented their movement as being progressive. They also presented pictures of the rapid improvement of living conditions under communism, and they preached independence from the Western colonists. After the defeat of Japan, the communists continued their fight, now against the returning French colonies. By 1954, after 7 years of guerrilla warfare, the French were forced to accept partition of their colony. The North now became the separate communist state of Viet Minh, sometimes called North Vietnam. South Vietnam became an independent democratic state. Laos became an independent kingdom, as did Cambodia. In Vietnam, there were strong leaders in power who aimed eventually at establishing democratic institutions. The vast majority of the South Vietnamese people had not previously participated in democratic self-government under colonial France. Now they had to be instructed in the new democratic ways. In all Southeast Asia after World War II and the eviction of the Japanese, it was only in Malaya that a colonial power was able to reassert a temporary hold. The reason that the British were welcomed back to Malaya was that the three racial groups living there, the Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians, mistrusted what each other's power might be in the new independent nation. But eventually they agreed upon a constitution. In 1957, Britain fulfilled her promise of giving Malaya its independence. The people went to the polls for the first time. The Philippines have ties with the West through the United States, which acquired them in 1898. They were granted their independence in 1946. The policy of the American government has always been to educate the people for citizenship in a democratic country. For this reason, when the Philippine people first voted, they were somewhat better prepared for their civic responsibility than other Southeast Asians. But even here, where there has never been an accepted colonialism, while a minority of workers are enjoying an improved standard of living, a great mass of laborers have as yet a bare subsistence. Thailand, formerly Siam, has had a more fortunate history. It is the only Southeast Asian country never subjected to Western rule. In 1932, Thailand changed from an absolute to a constitutional monarchy, controlled by wealthy merchants. In World War II, it sided with Japan, but the war brought little damage to Thailand, and it has since remained comparatively prosperous and peaceful. However, a large Chinese minority does present a potential source of trouble because it remains loyal to China. In 1947, Pakistan split from India, when both countries received their independence from Great Britain. Many of Pakistan's leaders, like its founder, Jinnah, have been educated in England and favored keeping the democratic government developed under British colonial rule. Boundary disputes between Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India are a constant source of friction. These are aggravated by their religious differences. India is the most populous and largest nation of Southeast Asia. Pandit Nehru, one of its founders, was also educated in England and in the democratic tradition. Since her independence, India has played a conciliatory role in international affairs, seeking peaceful coexistence among all nations, communist and democratic alike. India welcomes conferences with the new Asian and African countries about their common goals. In 1948, after 150 years of British rule, the island of Ceylon was given independence and dominion status in the British Commonwealth. Although now independent, demonstrations show that considerable anti-British feeling remains. This is because the English own most of the tea plantations, and tea is the main export of Ceylon. National sentiment has induced the Ceylonese government to declare that it will nationalize these English-owned tea plantations without compensation. With the independence of these Southeast Asian countries came membership in the United Nations and the need to concern themselves with their position on world affairs. Should they be pro-democratic, pro-communist, neutral, or part of a new third force? There were some who took each position. The United States, in meetings with her pro-democratic friends, faced a dilemma. She wished to champion the independence of all Southeast Asians, but she was also bound to her Western allies who had colonial interests. Soviet Russia immediately aligned herself with the newly created Southeast Asian nations. Her propaganda was for peaceful coexistence. She pretended to be for national independence and against foreign domination. The leaders of Southeast Asia were not all misled. While maneuvering to serve their own interests, they had no intention of substituting one imperialism for another. But the new governments of Southeast Asia are subject to continuing strong political pressures, both from the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sets up local Communist Party headquarters from which to propagandize its line. They tune their propaganda to the wavelengths of their listeners. And they encourage local groups to oppose their own governments. They set up showrooms from which to display their goods. Every Russian machine sold increases dependence on Russia for the necessary spare parts and service. But above all, the Russian communists send food. They well know that high-sounding phrases about democracy mean less than a mouthful to a starving man, and that they must overcome suspicion of their own colonizing intentions. America and the West fight the Soviet propaganda with educational programs of their own, and also offer practical help with food, machinery, and capital. Which side eventually has a greater influence on the Southeast Asian nations must affect the immediate future of the whole world. The Southeast Asian leaders, although grateful for help, are aware of their importance and bargain shrewdly to obtain aid without political entanglement. To stop communist infiltration, many of the Southeast Asian nations have also banded together to form the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, commonly known as SEATO. SEATO arranged to promote economic progress and work out mutual problems of aid and defense on a joint basis. In effect, then, Southeast Asia is in revolt against a long heritage of incredible poverty, of obsolete economic, political, and social institutions, and of Western domination. These new nations are trying in a few short years to catch up with decades of Western history. The Western nations, by discarding their colonial past, can gain the confidence of their Southeast Asian neighbors and offer them not just material help, but also an example of democratic freedom, the common road which ultimately we all wish to travel.